I've always loved the solitude of hiking. There's something about being deep in the wilderness, completely alone, that has always appealed to me. It's like a reset button for my mind. That's why, during a road trip through Oregon, I decided to take a detour and explore the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike, a way to break up my long drive with some much-needed fresh air. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, parked my car, and set off into the woods. I had chosen a lesser-known trail to ensure some privacy. No tourists, no noise, just me and the forest. The first few hours were perfect. The crisp autumn air, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional distant call of a bird. By the time the sun started setting, I had made camp near a quiet stream. I built a small fire, made some instant coffee, and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe a bad dream, maybe just the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. I sat up in my tent, listening carefully. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the rustling of an animal or the occasional snap of a branch, but deliberate, careful footsteps. They were slow, measured, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The steps stopped, and there was only silence. My heart pounded. I slowly reached for my flashlight and shined it outside the tent. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But I knew what I had heard. Trying to calm myself, I convinced myself it was probably just a deer, or maybe a lost hiker passing through. I lay back down, forcing my eyes shut, determined to get some sleep. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up again to the sound of rustling. Not footsteps this time, but something moving close to my tent. My entire body went rigid. I turned my head slightly, my ears honing in on the source of the noise. It sounded like someone was touching my tent, running their fingers along the fabric. I whispered, "Hello?" hoping, praying, it was just another hiker who had wandered too close. No response. Just breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. I bolted upright, grabbing my knife from my backpack. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, flashlight in hand. I swept the beam across the trees, my fingers gripping the handle of my knife so tightly they ached. Then I saw them. A pair of bare feet just outside my tent, mud-covered, motionless. I couldn't see the person's face, only their feet and the lower part of their legs. They were standing just outside the range of my flashlight, deliberately keeping their upper body hidden in the darkness. I froze, gripping my knife even tighter. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky. Nothing. They didn't move, didn't speak. I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged forward and slashed at the air in front of me, letting out a primal yell. My knife cut through nothing but the night, and when I aimed my flashlight back at where the feet had been, they were gone. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my backpack, threw everything I could into it, and bolted. I didn't bother packing up my tent. I just ran. My flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted down the trail, every shadow making my heart lurch. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I flung the door open, locked myself inside, and sat there, panting. My fingers fumbled for my keys, and I nearly dropped them trying to start the engine. The headlights illuminated the trailhead, revealing nothing. Just the empty trees swaying gently in the wind. I drove until the sun came up, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to pull into a gas station parking lot. I barely slept, my mind replaying the night over and over again. The next day, I debated whether to go back for my tent. Curiosity got the best of me, and I made the drive back to the trailhead, this time in the daylight. I hiked cautiously back to my campsite, my stomach in knots. Everything was how I left it, except for one thing. Right in front of where my tent had been, etched into the dirt, was a message written in jagged letters. You were supposed to stay. I never hiked alone again. I wouldn't call myself an expert hiker, but I've been doing it for decades. I've traversed most of the major trails in the US and visited nearly 75% of the country's national parks. Eventually, though, the usual trails weren't enough for me. I wanted something more exciting, something that felt like a real adventure. That's when I started scouring Google Maps for unnamed forests, isolated places that barely anyone had explored. I would go in with nothing but a map, a compass, and a pack of route marking stickers. These stickers helped me keep track of my way back. As I passed each one, I'd remove it, ensuring I left no trace. So far, it had worked perfectly. But that was before I decided to explore Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut. If you don't know, Dudleytown is an abandoned settlement with a reputation for being haunted. The entire town was abandoned in the 1800s, and people say it's cursed. There are strange disappearances, eerie whispers, and shadows moving in the trees. I don't believe in that stuff. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was looking for a challenge. Technically, the forest is off limits to the public, but I've gone to restricted areas before. The fact that no one else would be in the woods made it even more appealing. I wanted the place all to myself. I arrived at noon, ensuring I'd have plenty of time before dark. The first thing I noticed was how silent the forest was. People had mentioned this in their stories, but I wasn't prepared for how unnatural it felt. Usually, a forest is alive with noise, birds chirping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. But in Dudleytown, nothing. It felt like stepping into a vacuum. At first, I shrugged it off. I told myself that some forests just lack wildlife. I had seen it before. I pressed forward, placing stickers on trees every few minutes to mark my route. As I hiked, the unease started creeping in. I kept waiting to hear a squirrel darting through the leaves or a distant bird call. Nothing. The longer I walked, the worse it got. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that the silence was nothing more than a trick of the mind. Then I heard it, a long, drawn-out moaning sound echoing through the trees. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was wrong. I froze, straining to listen. Was it the wind? No, there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, but that horrible sound continued, low, mournful, almost like something was in pain. I told myself it had to be a wounded animal, but deep down, I knew better. I kept walking, moving away from the noise. Then I started thinking, how does an animal even get injured in a place like this? There were no hunters here, no predators. Had someone done something to it? The thought made my skin crawl. That's when I saw them, the carvings. At first, I thought they were just scratches in the bark. But then I noticed the shapes. Symbols, not letters, but deliberate markings, scattered across multiple trees. I walked closer, running my fingers over the deep cuts in the wood. They weren't fresh, but they also weren't old. Something in my gut told me I shouldn't be there. I turned around immediately, following my stickers back toward the entrance. I had been hiking for over an hour, so I knew it would take time. But as I walked, something felt off, and then I saw the cave. I stopped dead in my tracks. There was no way I had missed this before. It was a large, dark opening in the earth, almost like a bear's den. I know myself, I never would have overlooked something like this. Then I noticed something even worse. My stickers, the ones I had placed at shoulder height, were now at waist level. That's when it hit me. Someone had moved my markers. Someone had been following me. And they had been leading me straight to that cave. My stomach dropped. I turned and sprinted. I didn't care about staying quiet anymore. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the trees. How could I have been so stupid? Had someone been watching me this whole time? Had they been waiting for me to notice? Without my markers, I had no idea where I was. I ran blindly, trying to get as far away from the cave as possible. And then, the wailing started again. But this time, it was right behind me. I could feel it closing in. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I ran harder. I knew if I fell, if I tripped, that would be it. I finally yanked my phone out, praying for signal. 1 bar. I opened my GPS. My car was close. And then, the signal dropped. It didn't matter. I knew where to go now. I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I couldn't stop. And then, the forest ended. I burst into the clearing, gasping for air. The moment my feet hit the pavement, the wailing stopped. I turned. Nothing but trees. But I swear I could feel something watching me. I jumped into my car and peeled out, not stopping until I was miles away. That day ruined hiking for me. I tried to rationalize it afterward. Maybe it was a hermit living in the woods. Maybe someone tracked me, moved my markers, and tried luring me into that cave. But how did they stay hidden so well? How did they make that sound? Why did the wailing stop the moment I left the trees? I don't have answers. But maybe there's a reason Dudleytown is off limits, and maybe I was never supposed to leave. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, surrounded by dense forests and winding back roads. There wasn't much to do, so my friends and I spent a lot of time exploring the woods, camping, and daring each other to visit the places that had local legends attached to them. One of those places was the abandoned train tunnel, deep in the forest. The tunnel hadn't been used in decades, ever since the railway company deemed it unsafe due to structural damage. Some people said it had collapsed inside. Others said it was haunted. The most popular story was that a homeless man had been living there and went missing, and now his ghost haunted anyone who dared to enter. I never believed in ghost stories, but the tunnel itself was creepy. It was massive, carved into the hillside, surrounded by moss-covered stone. The entrance was pitch black, no end in sight. The air inside was damp and stale. One night, my friend Connor dared us all to go inside and walk all the way through to the other end. There were 4 of us: me, Connor, Luke, and Jackson. Armed with flashlights and a couple of beers, we set off down the old railway tracks. The night was quiet, except for the occasional rustling in the bushes, probably just animals. When we reached the entrance of the tunnel, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The darkness inside felt unnatural, like it was swallowing the light from our flashlights. But we were young and stupid, so we stepped inside. The air immediately felt colder. The damp walls dripped with condensation, and our footsteps echoed loudly. We walked deeper in, joking around to keep the tension at bay. Luke started making ghost noises, and Jackson laughed, but I noticed that Connor was unusually quiet. Then we heard it. A low, shuffling sound ahead of us. I stopped walking, holding my breath. "Did you hear that?" The others nodded. We shone our flashlights ahead, but the beams seemed to disappear into the darkness. The tunnel had a slight curve, so we couldn't see the other end, but I was sure something was moving in there with us. Connor whispered, "Let's turn back." Jackson, always the brave one, shook his head. "It's probably an animal. Let's just keep going." We hesitated but kept walking, slower this time. The shuffling continued, getting closer. Then, without warning, Luke's flashlight flickered and died. He cursed, smacking it against his palm. A second later, Jackson's went out too. Panic set in. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, but my hand was slick with sweat. The shuffling was now accompanied by a faint whispering sound, like someone muttering just out of earshot. "Okay, screw this," Connor said, turning around. "Let's get out of here." We didn't argue. We started walking quickly back toward the entrance. My flashlight flickered, and my heart pounded. We picked up the pace, breaking into a jog. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't in English. It wasn't even a language I could recognize. Then Jackson screamed. I turned and saw him on the ground, scrambling backward. Something grabbed me. He swung my flashlight around, and for a brief moment I saw it. A shadowy figure, barely human-shaped, crouched in the middle of the tunnel. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. Its head twitched in small, jerky movements. And then it lunged. We ran. Jackson scrambled to his feet, and we sprinted toward the exit. I could hear something behind us, the sound of bare feet slapping against the wet tunnel floor. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. The whispering had turned into laughter, high-pitched, inhuman. We burst out of the tunnel, nearly tripping over ourselves. Luke collapsed onto the ground, gasping. Jackson was shaking. Connor was looking back at the tunnel, his face pale. There was nothing there. The entrance gaped open, black as ever, but the sound had stopped. The laughter, the shuffling, it was gone. We didn't say a word. We just ran all the way back to town. None of us ever went near that tunnel again. We never talked about what we saw. I don't know what was in there, and I don't want to know, but sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear the whispering.